Stanford University.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second class session of the Stanford State of the Union 2014 class. Our focus tonight will be on the state of California, and we have a distinguished panel of guests, as we will always. The format for tonight's class is largely the same as we had for the first class, although with one small difference. We're welcoming to the teaching team David Kennedy, just back from a trip to China, and welcome. And right at the start of class, he's going to take about 10 minutes and use some slides to give us some background information about the history and evolution of politics in California as a scene setting for our conversation. At that point, I'll turn the floor over to Jim, as I did last week. Jim will make introductions of our distinguished guests. Each guest will have about 2 minutes, 3 minutes or so to say something of their own view of the state of California. Not very long, but then we'll leap into open discussion. Last week, we didn't have the opportunity to do what we're going to do this week, which is use some of the questions that were posted by you here in the class on the online discussion board. We'll occasionally make reference to you by name, at the very least to the topic of the question. And that opportunity will be open for the rest of the class. If you choose to participate online, we'll cull through the questions and use some of them in our discussion here on stage. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Professor Kennedy.
Well, thank you, Rob. I'm sorry I wasn't here last week, and I'm glad I'm here tonight, although you should know that I just flew in this morning from Beijing, and my brain is still somewhere out near Midway Island. So if I go ravingly incoherent in the midst of this presentation, I hope you'll understand why. California occupies a peculiar place in the history of the Republic, and not least of all in our imaginations. Whenever I think about California, I'm reminded of a very famous statement by the Sacramento-born California author Joan Didion, who said, "Things had better work out here, because here, beneath this immense bleached sky, is where we run out of continent." So California is at one and the same time in our national memory and imagination the culmination of a long period of historical development, and it's also in some ways our last chance to get things right. Now, the fact is that things have worked out very well in California for a century and a half following statehood in 1850. And this little bit of a schematic map here tells that story in a kind of, as I say, a schematic way. One of the artifacts of our constitutionally mandated decennial census is that we have excellent data about ourselves as a people going back to the first census in 1790. And one of the things that the Census Bureau demographers calculate every 10 years is something called the population center of gravity. These little red triangles represent where the methodology is fairly simple. If you imagine a map of the United States as a weightless plane and then distribute on it weights according to where people live, hypothetically, where that map would balance on a needle point is the population center of gravity. So this schematically represents something that's familiar to everyone in this room, the fabled westward movement. You see the population center of gravity in the first census of 1790 is up here at the head of the Chesapeake Bay, and then it marches dramatically across the continent until about 1880, when the westward movement slows down considerably, barely makes it across the state of Indiana for the next 60 years or so. And then following World War II, as we see here, the westward movement begins again with a vengeance and also bends southward. So that by 2010, the last census, the population center of gravity was outside a hamlet called Plato, Missouri. And if this trend has no claim on our attention other than the fact that that's where the population center of gravity is, if this trend continues, that'll be in Texas within a few years, a few decades. And by that time, we'll be a majority Western country. Most Americans will live west of the midpoint of the continent. Now, this did not just happen. The reason that population movement slowed down so badly in the mid to late 19th century that you saw, just to go back for a moment to remind you, this is the period of the great slowdown in the westward movement. The reason it slowed down because settlement at about that time hit this zone here called the 100th meridian and the so-called arid region of the United States. And the West at large, and California in particular, simply was not habitable on the scale that the eastern and humid, well-watered half of the continent was until something happened. And the something that happened beginning in the early 20th century, and especially in the mid part of the 20th century, was an enormous set of federal projects to irrigate the West. Every major western river has been dammed, most of them many times over. And the federal presence in this region, despite all of our mythology about cowpokes and Indian fighters and sodbusters and wagon trainers and all the rest of it, the federal government has been a far larger agent in the shaping of this region than all the cowpokes there ever were. And this map, again, schematically shows that point. Even here in the beginning of the 21st century, the federal government remains the biggest landlord in the region. The little red maps inside of each state map show the percentage of land surface in every state owned to this day by the federal government. And again, if you ask people what is distinctive about the West, it's not only that it's the arid region, but also it's the region where the federal government has continued to play a role in the development of the area, unlike anything that's comparable in the eastern part of the United States. Much of this has to do with a person who actually has a Stanford connection, Francis G. Newlands. Francis Newlands in the late 19th century was the president of something called the Spring Valley Water Company. It supplied San Francisco with water, and it built Searsville Dam on San Francisco Creek. That dam is now inside the Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve. Many of you have probably seen it. Francis Newlands went on to the United States Senate, where in 1902 he became the principal author of something called the Reclamation Act, also known as the Newlands Act, for obvious reasons. And the Newlands Act became the principal agency through which the federal government went into the business of building these dams all over the West. Here's Hoover Dam, the most iconic of them all, I suppose. The first really large-scale dam comes online in 1935. My point is simply there is a kind of a genealogical line of descent through Francis G. Newlands from Searsville Dam, built in the 1880s, just a few miles west of here, and all the dams across the major rivers of the United States today. If I can ask you to keep in your mind's eye this little white cuticle around the edge of Lake Mead here, the impound behind Hoover Dam, so I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. This is Shasta Dam, of course, in the upper Sacramento, another federal project, incidentally, that supplies water to the Central Valley Project. Here is a schematic of the plumbing system of this state, which is highly elaborate. And let me just say the obvious. California and the West in general simply would not be the region and the state that they are had it not been for these enormous infrastructural investments, mostly federal, mostly in the early and mid 20th century. It's for that reason that California in 1962 became the most populous state. 1 out of every American now lives in California. 1 out of every 5 Americans lives in either California or Texas. That's the second biggest state, also in the West. And 1 out of every 3 Americans lives in the 17 western states. And to repeat, in about 20 to 40 years' time, somewhere in that time frame, the West will be the most populated region in the United States. And a corollary of that is that the West has assumed the role that the Northeast had a century ago. It is the principal destination for immigration in the United States. Again, you can see at a glance, with the exception of southern Florida and the New York area, the West in general is the destination for most foreign-born persons in the United States today. The Hispanic population, of course, is especially concentrated in the western states, between here and Houston, essentially. Asian population, even more concentrated in the West, smaller numerically than Hispanic, but heavily concentrated in California and Washington states, as it happens. And interestingly, the census in 2000 and 2010 allowed people to identify themselves as belonging to one or more than one race or ethnicity. And the West, again, is the area where more people identified themselves in that fashion than anywhere else. So we're not only the source or the target or the destination for heavy immigration, but we are also a place with heavy intermarriage and a very rapidly changing ethnic composition of the western region. California is one of 4 majority-minority states. They're all in the West: Texas, California, New Mexico, and Hawaii, where no ethnic or racial group has a majority. And Santa Clara County, where we're sitting, is a microcosm of this phenomenon. It's a majority-minority county, and the prediction is that within a decade or so, there will be an ethnic majority in Santa Clara County, and it will be Asian. Quite a surprise to a lot of people who've lived here for a long time. The West is also the youngest part of the country, as this map shows. The lighter the coloration, the lower the average age. So this is a region of considerable demographic dynamism, and it has been ever since the end of World War II. And of course, it goes hand in hand with the fact that the West is economically the most productive part of the country. A third of GDP emanates from the West. The West is responsible for more than 50% of all exports to Asia. And it is, of course, right here where we're sitting, the birthplace of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley claims 25% roughly of all venture capital investment in the United States in a 2 or 3 county region. All this demographic growth and economic dynamism, of course, has electoral or political implications. This is a map that shows the redistribution of congressional seats after the 2010 reapportionment. And again, you'll see the Southeast and the West are the 2 big gainers, the Northeast, the big loser. There's another fact that this map reflects that let me just highlight for you. California, you'll see, is one of the states that neither gained nor lost a congressional seat in 2010. Texas gained 4. This is only the second time since California became a state in 1850 that California did not gain at least 1 congressional seat in the decennial reapportionment. So this remains a dynamic state, but there are other parts of the West that, at least at the current moment, seem even more dynamic, namely Texas. This is a photograph that I'm particularly fond of because it summarizes a lot of what I'm trying to say. It is, of course, a presidential inauguration. The president being inaugurated is down here, California's own Ronald Reagan. This is January of 1981. The reason I love this photograph is because of the direction that Reagan is facing as he took the oath of office. He's facing down the mall toward the Washington Monument. He's facing westward. Turns out every president inaugurated in Washington, D.C. since the first Washington, D.C. inaugural of Thomas Jefferson in 1801, every inaugural took place on the eastern facade of the Capitol. When it came time to brief Reagan about the particulars of his inauguration, he said, "Nothing doing. I'm a man of the West. I want to be facing west. That's where the future is when I take the oath of office." So this is the first presidential inauguration held on the west facade of the Capitol. Every presidential inaugural since has taken place on the western facade of the Capitol. It seems to me a very nice, poetic way to sum up what I've been trying to say about the success of this region. Now, that's the good news. The bad news, or less cheerful news, is, I'm just going to raise it as a question, have we reached, in various dimensions of our experience, limits on the future of this trajectory of extremely successful growth and dynamism that I've just been talking about? One of the limits may be simply physical, that despite all our engineering prowess and our scientific creativity, there may be physical limits to just how much we can push Mother Nature around, especially by way of rearranging water supply and distribution in this region. This is a photograph taken in 1977 in the lower San Joaquin Valley, where much of the water for agriculture had been supplied over years through groundwater pumping. And the geological formation there is such that when you pump water out of the aquifer, the soil and the rock are soft enough they collapse, so the aquifer can never be recharged, and of course on the surface you get subsidence. So up here is where the surface of the Earth was in 1925. This is where it was in 1955. This is where it was in 1977. Bruce Cain and I, the Bill Lane Center for the American West, intend to take a group of students down there sometime in the next several months with GPS tools and try to find this site and take a photograph of where it is in 2014 or 15. I guarantee you it's even lower still. The point is simply that the Earth itself has a say in these grand schemes of ours, and that maybe we've reached some kind of physical limit about our ability to rearrange, especially the critical resource of water. Something else has changed in the time since California was such a dynamic place, and that is we have changed our scientific standards and our cultural understandings and our legal statutes about the claims of species other than human beings, especially on the scarce resource of water. This, of course, is the Delta smelt. That little critter was put on the endangered species list by the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service a few years ago. And a federal judge in Fresno, Oliver Wanger, declared he had very little discretion in the decision, that because of that, the great pumps out at Tracy that pump water from the California State Water Projects had to be shut down or slowed down considerably, and this exacerbated an already tough drought condition in the Central Valley. And lastly, I'll just mention climate change, which people in this room don't need any further instruction about, I'm sure. But let me just point out that in the West at large, not least of all in California, measured over the last half century, there is simply less water in the snowpack every year than there used to be. And let me just underline the obvious, water is absolutely essential for human life. And the management of water across large scales of time and distance is essential to life in this region in a way that it is not elsewhere, especially in California. The spring runoff also happens earlier than it did historically. We built our plumbing system in this region and in California on specifications based on historical data, scientific data from the late 19th and early 20th century. We're now in a climate period where those data are no longer relevant. And to make a long story short, what this really tells us is the dry season is now longer than it used to be, and we need to impound water in larger amounts to sustain us over a longer dry season than we did when we built the plumbing system that we have. And again, people in California need no reminding, longer dry season also means more and larger fires. There's a tendency, and I'm sure Darrell Steinberg will have something to say about this, to blame the politicians. Why not? There they are. That's part of their job description. Take ritual abuse. If you drive up and down the Central Valley today, you'll see signs like this that claim there is an easy political solution to drought conditions and water management conditions. And if we just impeached a few politicians, everything would be hunky-dory. I'm sure Mr. Steinberg is going to have a dissenting opinion about that. Stop the Congress-created Dust Bowl. Again, you can see these signs all up and down I-5 if you take that drive. I asked you a moment ago to take a mental snapshot of that cuticle, so-called bathtub ring around the edge of Lake Mead. That photograph was taken probably 20 years ago. This is what Lake Mead looks like today. That cuticle is now about 40 feet deep. That's this area here that defines how the water level has dropped in the lake. Something in the neighborhood of 30 million people in Southern California and the Southwest generally depend on that lake for their drinking water and other water. And our best estimate is that the Lake Mead Reservoir will never, ever be recharged. So I'll just end there with that little bit of an introduction to what made California great and raising the question whether it can continue. But since we're going to be talking about politics, I thought I would close by invoking one of the great California politicians, Hiram Johnson, in California about a century ago, who, among other things, was the chief sponsor of the set of reforms that gave us the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. There are those of us in this room who think that some of those devices have reminded us of the old maxim about being careful what you wish for. But here is what Hiram Johnson said when he introduced those items into California just about a century ago. He said, "The initiative and the referendum depend on our confidence in the people and their ability to govern. Those of us who espouse these measures do so because of our deep-rooted belief in popular government, and not only in the right of the people to govern, but in their ability to govern." Whether that faith was well placed is a question I will leave to others on the panel. Thanks.
Okay. So now we have that is a great scene setter, David. Welcome back. We're really glad to have you back. So I'm going to introduce the panel, and we're going to have them give little opening remarks. And the one thing I want to say, Rob, we didn't mention this, and David and Rob and I mentioned this, but we're going to start to do, these guys have all been taped before they came out here with their own versions of State of the Union. And we're going to be able to put them, I think we're going to probably post them for you guys before next week's class.
I think so.
And when you see that, we also did it with Joel Benenson, Mark McKinnon, Steve Schmidt, and Ruth Marcus from last week. And the big surprise is we're going to, at some point, ask you guys to start thinking about creating your own State of the Union messages. So we're going to come back with more ideas about it. It's not required part of the class, but we would like to engage you in this. And we're going to be using some of your questions tonight, but we're also going to start to let you guys do your own State of the Union messages. So here, with David's setup, are three incredible experts on California politics to talk about what does this all mean. So over to my farthest right and your left, Bruce Cain is a professor of political science here at Stanford. Also one of the true great experts on politics in California. He was a longtime Cal professor. He ran the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley. He then ran Cal's program in Washington, D.C. He's one of the great political experts on the state of California, politics in California, and he will have a lot to say tonight about the state of the current state and the union here and where we might go. And next to Bruce is our friend Carla Marinucci, who is one of the most respected, if not the most respected journalists, political journalists in California. She's been at the San Francisco Chronicle for a few years now. She's covered four or five presidential campaigns, numerous gubernatorial campaigns, has won many of the leading journalist awards here in California. I actually think one thing, Carla is a first person in her family to go to college, grew up, went to high school in Santa Clara, went to San Jose State, and became one of the most important political journalists in California and the country. And if you're involved in politics like Darrell over here is, trust me, you read what Carla Marinucci has to say. And last but not least, we have Darrell Steinberg. And it's worth an introduction because Darrell's name in our office at Common Sense is Senator GSD, which means get stuff done. Because the state of California, which we're going to talk about, has been a story of incredible progress over the past few years. And it's really been the leadership of Jerry Brown and his fine wife, Ann Gust Brown, in the governor's mansion, or office at least, and Darrell Steinberg running the legislature. And Darrell is now stepping down at the end of, in the next month or so, as the head of the state Senate. But this has been an extraordinary record of political functionality as opposed to the dysfunction we talked about last week. And much of it is really due to Darrell's leadership. And so just to tick off, in my day job, we've worked with Darrell on the most important consumer privacy bill in 20 years in the United States. Last year, the eraser button. We worked on massive education reform in the state with Darrell. We worked on major hundreds of millions of dollars going into early childhood now in California that Darrell personally shepherded through. And last night, I got a call from Darrell saying that the first major student privacy law in the United States, which we worked on together, was signed by Governor Brown. So Darrell Steinberg is sort of an exemplar of how California can actually work politically, which is what we're going to talk about. Here's the bad thing about Darrell, however. He went to Cal and UCLA, and he always talks about the Golden Bears and signs every note to me with Go Bears. So in honor of that, I would just like to tell you that Darrell tonight has to wear Fear the Tree hat throughout the entire class.
It's a setup.
The entire class, he has to wear the hat. Okay, and with that,
Tweet it, someone.
that's good.
I would have gone to Stanford had I been admitted. That's all I can say. Thank you.
Okay. So with that, maybe, here's the thing. I think we're going to now say the State of the Union of California politics. Bruce, you want to kick it off? And then we'll just launch into our normal discussion. So, Bruce.
Well, you start off with the more negative approach, so I'll do that. I think there's no question that California is in a better place than it was 5 years ago, but I don't think we have any understanding of why. And you can divide it into two types of explanations. One is things that we did, and the other is things that happened to us. And it's entirely possible that what we are observing right now has more to do with what happened to us than what we did. And what happened to us is that economic cycles come and go. And there's not much that we can do at the state level to change national economic conditions. And increasingly, there's not much that presidents can do to affect national economic conditions because it's in the hands of the Federal Reserve or it's in the hands of the international economy or the bankers or whatever. So what we don't know is whether the glow of satisfaction that we have is due to the fact that the economy recovered, we have some revenues, and we're not sort of scrambling over each other to get money. But we also did things that might have improved the situation, but the problem there is that unlike good scientists that change one thing at a time and test it, we change everything at once and we have no idea what worked. So we changed the top two system. We changed the redistricting system. We brought in an experienced governor instead of an inexperienced governor. We finally got some more experienced people in the legislature, and we've changed the term limits law. So the list of things that we did makes it very hard to figure out which of these things might have had any effect. And so while I'm happy that we're in a better state than we were 5 years ago, I'm uneasy about the fact that some of the things that David was talking about with respect to water, some of the programs that we've had to cut very seriously, and you know, Darrell and the governor have done a very good job of trying to make compromises, but the reality is there were costs. There were costs that he didn't like, that none of us like, in terms of services that were cut. The UC system has been cut 36%. They've never going to get the level of funding that they had before. So underneath the glow of satisfaction, there is this unease that our structural problems and are not, haven't been solved, but merely been postponed by the good times.
Carla, what do you say to that?
Well, I say that, well, first, I have the joy of covering politics in this great state. You know, we call it the second oldest profession, Senator. I hope you don't mind. But the fact is that when Bruce, the whole governor's race this year is being debated about the California comeback. And is California still the Golden State? And look, my family came here in the 60s, literally in a station wagon altogether, because my parents thought this was the place for education for their kids. And at Jerry Brown, when he went to Cal, tuition was $100 a unit. And now, a semester, $13,000. So the California comeback, that is the debate. And when we look at what's going on in California, I think we can see so many things that are golden about the Golden State. Look, I mean, when you talk about some of the laws that we're passing in this state, just this week, a whole handful of laws that are first in the nation laws, whether you talk about the plastic bag ban, whether I mean, it goes on, and Senator, you wrote some of those laws that were signed this week. We're a trendsetter in so many ways, whether you talk about AB 32, or whether you talk about Prop 13 in the tax revolution. It happens here first in California in so many ways. And when you talk about the kind of political figures I get to cover every day, I mean, you don't see these personalities in other states. I'm sorry. I was with Arnold Schwarzenegger in the green room of Jay Leno's Tonight Show when he announced for governor, and that just does not happen in any state. And I remember the night he was elected, I was standing by the side of the stage, and he came up to me and said, "Only in America and only in California." And that is the way it happens here. That's the way we roll in California. But I still think that when in San Francisco every day, you're seeing, those Google buses coming in and picking up the very affluent young kids and taking them down to Mountain View, and you're also seeing kids that are getting no education or living in motels. The income inequality issue is still here, and there are still plenty of problems to be addressed in California. Yet, that's what makes it the dynamic state. This is the state whose motto is Eureka, I found it. So that's California.
Okay, thanks, Carla.
Thank you very much, Jim, for having me, first of all. It's an honor to be here. I want to bring you a little bit of a different perspective, and maybe it's a perspective about my view on American democracy. Because let's stipulate for a moment that the problems that we continue to face in California are tremendous. There are significant unmet challenges, which I hope we get a chance to talk about tonight. But if anyone is looking for absolutes or for perfection, and I don't think any of you are, but if anyone is, then they ought to go look at another system of governance and have a great time, because this is a system which is premised purposely on making things go slow. It's a separation of powers. And the founding fathers wanted us to run into obstacles when we try to pass important laws or important changes. So having said all of that, when you look at the history of California over the last 6 years, which is my horizon, I've been in the legislature 14, but 6 as leader of the Senate, it is night and day. 6 years ago, we had a $40+ billion deficit with a $100 billion base budget. And the country thought we were laughingstocks, late budgets into the summer and early fall. There was no way out of this. And I'll tell you why it changed, and Bruce Cain hit on a couple of these things, and I think that there is real cause and effect. Number one, the people decided to make some significant constitutional change. None more important than Proposition 25, which allows for the passage of a budget in California now with a majority vote. Why is that important? Because the minority, just a fact, too often was using the budget process as leverage, and they took it too far to get what they wanted. And as a result, budgets were late, and it reduced the people's confidence in California. No more late budgets in California. The voters also passed Proposition 30, which provided a temporary tax increase to end the era of cutting in California, which went too far and too deep. Second reason, we have elected now a governor with the experience and the wisdom to know just how far to push and when to step back. Now, by the way, as the leader of the legislative branch, or one house of the legislative branch, I often disagree with Governor Brown. I hope we get to talk about that a few times tonight. But he's been an excellent governor in terms of his overall leadership. And number three, the beleaguered legislature never, ever, ever shied away from making the tough decisions during these 6 years, especially when it came to budget cuts. I did not come to cut education, higher education, mental health, foster care, anything else, and yet we had to. And because we did, combined with the tax increases, combined with the governance changes, we are now in better shape. The question going forward as I exit, Governor Brown continues and a new legislature comes in, is whether or not we're going to make the same progress and produce for the people in real increments in a way that he can look back and we can look back 4 or 5 years from now and say, look how much better it is now. Thank you.
So let's start off the questioning, and we'll go. I want to do a follow-up to you guys. So, and Bruce, yes, you did. You painted, I don't think it was a negative picture, but you're saying, how good is this really?
I like to think of it as balance.
But balance.
Balance, of course.
Balance. So here's my quick question, and then Rob and David take it over. Here's my question to you. What is the single biggest one-word answer or one-sentence answer? What's the single biggest challenge facing California in the next 5 years, Darrell? If you could have one challenge, what's the single biggest challenge?
Changing secondary education to better prepare young people for college and the workforce, making education relevant to what we expect young people to do what we expect them to do in their futures.
So Darrell worked a ton, by the way, he worked a ton on that the last couple of years.
$500 million
Huge
for
ton.
career pathways to reform high school education so that it's both academically rigorous but career applied across the board. Doesn't have to be either or.
So that's your biggest challenge. Carla, what would you say?
I think education is the challenge, and I think, look, in the governor's race right now, we're looking at an issue, the Vergara decision on teacher tenure, which we haven't heard a lot from Jerry Brown on, or the Democrats, I may say. I'd like to hear what you have to say on it, because this is an issue that, where you're talking about teacher tenure, 2 years for elementary school teachers. What's the effect out there? How do average parents and voters see that? And where is that going to go in terms of how it affects just elementary school students, millions of them?
So you would say educate. You would also say education.
I would absolutely say education.
By the way, next week and the week after, next week we have Randy Weingarten, head of the most important teachers union in America, Linda Darling-Hammond from Stanford, and the well-known conservative education expert Checker Finn to debate the Vergara case, among other things.
That's huge.
And the following week, Reed Hastings to debate with Janet Napolitano over education technology in the future. So we're going to have a lot of chance to talk about education. So two people voted education. I know, David, I bet I know what you would say is the biggest challenge. But Bruce, what would you go?
Well, since we know what David's going to say, and he's right, water, I'm going to let him have water, and I'm going to take the budget, which, by the way, Darrell left out the fact that we also did something interesting that confuses the causal situation, is that we threaten not to pay our legislators if they don't pass a budget on time. And the legislature actually challenged that, and the treasurer said, no, I'm not going to pay you. And I think that actually may have made a big difference. And I've said to people thinking about federal reform that we should consider this as a federal reform, not paying the Congress 1 penny and not giving any of the money back to them in retrospective pay, and just see whether that makes a difference.
Oh, man.
You got to take them on, Darrell.
Do I get a response
Yes,
there?
you do. You do.
Understanding how popular that notion is, it is one of the worst ideas that has ever come forward
why you know it's good.
in a democratic government. And let me tell you why. Because you do not want your legislature to say, I'm in a good faith dispute with a governor or the other party, and it's a good faith dispute over whether or not we should cut mental health services, to use one of my examples, by another $500 million. And if we don't do that, we're going to lose our pay. It sounds great, but if you have principled people arguing about principled differences, it's the last thing in the world that you want an elected official to base their judgment on. I think it's a horrible idea. And by the way, we prevailed in the Court of Appeal, Steinberg versus Chung. I know it's not going to get me any votes, but Steinberg versus Chung, no longer can a controller hold that sword of Damocles over the legislature and say, you balance the budget my way, or we're not going to pay you. Love Bruce Cain, but got a little
Jim,
disagreement there.
others have already answered the question for me, but if I could be allowed to answer it for myself.
Absolutely.
Because I heard your question in a particular way. You said, what's the biggest challenge?
Challenge, correct.
Whereas I think people tended to answer, what's the most important thing? And
Yeah.
Well, I didn't
those
get a
are
chance to
distinguishable.
say what I thought the challenge
Well,
was.
okay, go ahead. Then I'll yield the floor to you, Bruce.
All right. The most important challenge, I think, that went untouched by this is the increasingly pro-cyclical nature of our revenues in the state.
Yeah.
And that, unfortunately, means, and I know this because I've run basically a state organization, namely UCDC. It's very hard to run an organization if you don't know what your budget is. Right. And if the revenues are going to get cut, you don't know what staff to keep, what programs to run. And you can't run a deficit at the state level. You can, but the press will jump on you if you use the budgetary tricks. And I don't think we've really come to grips with this. We haven't come to grips with Prop 13 and what that means. And to me, if we don't really resolve those problems, we're just waiting for the next recession and the next time we're in dire straits.
Well, I don't want to deny the importance of budgets and revenue, the revenue cycle, education, certainly, and water. Let me just acknowledge that. But it seems to me the biggest challenge, that is the problem that it seems, to my eyes at least, to look to be the least tractable and terribly important, is unfunded public pensions.
Yeah.
Because it's embedded in contract law and politics and interest groups, and the layers of complexity in that issue are huge, and the scale of the problem is huge. And I just wonder if there's any creative thinking in Sacramento about how to deal with that.
Well, in 2012, we actually made real progress, although arguably not all the way. The philosophical issue is whether you believe in what are called defined benefit pensions, which are guaranteed pensions, or the model that the private sector employs most often, which are defined contributions, which means that your retirement could be gone when the stock market goes down. I believe in defined benefit, but I agree with Professor Kennedy that they have to be affordable. What we did in 2012, prior to the election, Proposition 30, is we said that over the course of the next 5 years, every public employee has to contribute at least 50% of the annual cost of their pensions. In addition, for new employees, we brought down the retirement formulas. We raised the age of retirement across the board, including for public safety employees. And it's our hope that that cost curve, which is the unfunded liability over 30 years, begins to bend. Now, we'll see whether it's enough and whether or not a future legislature has to go back to that. But we did make a very big stab at it and passed a significant bill.
What's the conventional number that's used? What is the amount of unfunded pensions now?
It's in the hundreds of millions of dollars, depending upon whether...
Hundreds of billions.
In the billions, excuse me. Depending on whether or not you look at just the state employees or you look at the local employees as well. Those are projections depending upon future interest rates and the state of the economy. But what we did do in 2012 is assure that public employees will be putting a lot more money into that fund themselves. Under the current system, depending on the contract, you do have situations where employees contribute 0% or 5%, and employers contribute the whole thing, sort of the sweetheart deals. Those are now gone, not just for new employees, but for existing employees as well.
But Senator, how are you going to get that done when you're talking about some of the battles that are going on in California, even now during an election year? Labor's a very big force, and when you have people like Chuck Reed, mayor of San Jose, trying to put pension reform out there and getting hammered for doing it, what is the reality here in terms of ability to address this issue?
The reality is, well, two things. Number one, organized labor was very unhappy with the 2012 state reform. We did it anyways. You know, I gave a speech at the very end of my tenure last month where I laid out the 10 things I thought, 10 lessons I've learned. And one of them was, in a democracy, no interest group should win every time. If they do, there's something wrong. And so they were unhappy with that. But the truth of the matter is they are a powerful force, and they do have a point. Their point is that we ought not to relegate all workers in California to the defined contribution plans that are uncertain. And so, like everything else in a democracy, a functional democracy, you make big advances, even if it doesn't solve the entire problem in one fell swoop. And then you take another chunk at it, if you need to, down the line. That's where I think we're at.
I want to come back to one of the issues we started off with, which is whether or not we should feel good about California working, or whether or not, as Bruce suggested, it's a whole bunch of stuff that happened to us. So I'm not an expert on California politics, but I recall a bunch of things in the wake of the 2012 election that were said that were meant to be something to explain why we could be more hopeful about California's future, especially coming off of the discussion we had in this class last week about the dysfunction in the democratic institutions in the nation's capital. And of course, there's rigid partisanship and polarization in DC. But in the wake of the 2012 election here in California, we basically have single party rule here in California. And from the outside, one might think, of course things work well when it's one party that is in charge of getting stuff done. And all the checks and balances you talked about exist, of course, in theory. But there's basically supermajorities in Sacramento of Democrats. The governorship is almost certainly going to remain in the Democratic Party. And then, of course, at the national level, we never see a presidential candidate enter the state except to raise money, because it's a lock for Democrats in the Electoral College. So we have something approaching the vanquishing of the Republican Party here in California, and maybe that explains why the state's working well. I don't mean that I don't mean to say that in favor of Democrats as having the right ideas, but you can get stuff done if you control all of the relevant positions of political influence.
So Darrell, try to be objective now.
Well, I want to make sure I don't dominate this here.
We won't let you, Darrell. Don't worry.
The politician, everyone's I think there are a few things. I like the idea. It's why I like Prop 25, and I liked our supermajority, which, by the way, only existed for 1 year, because in 2014 we had a couple of Democratic senators who, three, as a matter of fact, who I had to suspend, two arrested for corruption, alleged corruption, and one convicted. So that's life. Terrible. It's actually been terrible. But we've had the supermajority in 13 and not in 14. In 13, you're darn right, it was nice to have the authority and to be held accountable. It was on us, and I certainly set the tone by saying, we passed a tax increase in 2012. We're not dealing with tax measures in 2013. Excuse me. I held every one of them, even ones I like, right, that I would vote for. But I said, we're not moving them because we have to use this new power responsibly. The other thing that occurred, which was interesting to me...
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
You would prefer to lose the supermajority and then to pass tax reform? Is that what the implication of that is?
I just thought in the year after the voters passed a major tax increase, I thought it was inappropriate to consider new tax measures in 2013. I said a one-year moratorium. We're not doing any of this.
I see.
And then in 14, we lost the supermajority. But here's the other thing that happened. The Republicans now have begun, and I emphasize just begun, to finally get it, because they had so marginalized themselves that what we're seeing now, at least what I saw in the Senate this year, members like Anthony Cannella and others, who are voting a lot more of a moderate line. In fact, conservative Republicans this year voted for some gay rights bills. They voted for immigration bills. They voted in ways that would have been unheard of even 3 or 4 years ago. So I think the combination of, yes, more power and accountability that goes with that, but also the minority recognizing that they have to come more to the center, it's made for a more functional government in California.
Right now, the California Republican Party is down to 19% registration compared to 43% for the Democrats. It's huge. But the fact is, some people point to this. Democrats holding both houses of the legislature, all statewide offices, the governorship, for perhaps an arrogance of power. Some people point to the problems in the Senate and say, maybe is that some of the reason? The fact is, at the local level, city councils and mayors, the majority of those positions are held in California by Republicans or more conservative candidates, which suggests maybe people, when they're dealing with their money, maybe they want more conservative folks running the show, which is why you're starting to see some Republican candidates, as you said, kind of get it, particularly on the social issues. Look, the candidate for governor right now is a pro-gay marriage, pro-choice, Neil Kashkari. You never would have seen that not too long ago.
But they relegate him to the second day of the Republican state convention, though.
Yeah. And
at
still
1
gets
a.m.
dished by his own party.
speak.
You're absolutely right. But they have a couple of credible candidates. Ashley Swearingen is running for state controller, mayor of Fresno, which is a Democratic city. A Republican. Will she get elected? Probably not, because the Republicans just are so behind the curve here. But the fact is, she's making a credible challenge. And I think we're starting to see some shifts in the Republican Party.
Can we stay on this? Because think about the last 15 years in California. So I can recall very well when I was running Children Now, dealing with first George Deukmejian and then Pete Wilson, right? And I remember Pete Wilson, although we didn't have this business school at that point, we had the other business school. But I remember in a debate with Pete Wilson here when he was doing Prop 187, right? So we had, first of all, Ronald Reagan, then we had Deukmejian, then we had Pete Wilson, we had Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was a moderate Republican, but was clearly an out there Republican. What happened to the Republican Party in California, and how did this switch so fast in such a big way? I mean, Bruce, you know it really well, too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was not just a complete switch. I mean, what had happened was you had two very important demographic changes that were eroding the sands underneath the Republican castle. First of all, you had the rise of the Latino and Asian population. So if you go back to the 70s, you had a growing minority population, but in terms of the electorate, it was 70% white. That dropped, partly because we're getting into the second generation of immigrants that are now eligible to get registered. There were some events like 187 that spurred the community.
You guys all know 187, Pete Wilson's initiative that basically denied immigrants.
Yeah, well, there was a trio of these that really, I think, energized eligible Latinos to get registered. So, number one is that, and David talked about that in his beginning talk, and it's a very, very important talk. And you're seeing that that's changing other states as well. We think we're taking a look at Arizona and Texas and looking at how the demographic changes in the growing Hispanic population are changing those states as well. But the second demographic change that we don't focus on as much, but it's equally important, is the movement of white-collar creative workers, many of whom may be in the audience here, who moved to the creative centers, the Bostons, the Austins, the Boulders, the northern part of Virginia, the southern part of New Hampshire, et cetera. And these are all states that you're seeing transform because of the movement of workers into these creative centers. And in California, particularly on the coastal regions, with the inner areas being the more conservative areas. So I think that erosion was going underneath. Now, on top of that was the fact that the way the party system works, it's open to capture by the activists and the ideologues. We've changed our primary rules several times, trying to get independent voters and indifferent voters to vote. But it's very hard to empower the indifferent, because the indifferent aren't motivated to vote. And so when we open up the doors and we say, please come in and save the Republican Party, people say, well, I'd rather watch TV. So it doesn't happen, basically. And this is something that I have a book coming out in November on this subject, which is that a lot of our reforms in this country have been based on a romantic notion of what citizenship is. And so we create a lot of opportunities for citizens to participate, but what they become is opportunities for special interests and people that are more motivated to capture. And there's nothing that illustrates this better than what's happening to the Republican Party nationally and what has happened to the Republican Party in the last 10 or 15 years. The people that show up in the primary are the ones that care the most. The ones that care the most are the most ideological. The ones that are more moderate are more indifferent and don't show up to politics. And this is replicated up and down all the reforms that we've done in the last 20 or 30 years.
Any other comments on that?
I think we should talk about water. Let's talk about water. Let's talk about the drought. Here's a good chance to get a question in from one of the students who posted this before. I'm going to read this because this hasn't been fact-checked. Someone here can tell me if any of this is wrong. The photos that David showed are, of course, striking, and we have no reason to think that in the immediate future this is going to get any better. So here's a question. 25 million Californians, or 65% of the state's population, depend upon the federal Central Valley Project and California State Water Project to deliver them trillions of gallons of water, fresh water each year. And of course, agriculture is one of the main industries to benefit from the large-scale water diversion. 35% of the water removed from Sacramento, San Joaquin River Delta, which feeds into San Francisco Bay, is used in the western San Joaquin River Valley, which is the driest part of the region. So the question asks to confront the idea that we are engaging in a massively inefficient use of the scarce resource of water we have because we're prioritizing immediate agricultural success in essentially a fundamentally dry region.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I want to jump in on that because it's actually, when I was in DC, it was the question that I got most often about water. Why in a state that is overwhelmingly, the population is in urban and suburban areas, are you struggling to put water into the agricultural sector? What is the political dynamic that allows that to happen over and over again? And why are urban and suburban users cutting their usage of water when you're only using maybe a fifth of the water and the rest of it is going to, or a large proportion is going to agriculture? And we can spin a story about why that's true, but it does suggest to me that if this is really going to be a 10-year drought, the throats that will be cut will ultimately be agriculture. You're not going to turn off the tap. Now, the first thing you can do is that you can end outdoor water use by suburban, and that's politically an easier thing to do than to take on agriculture in the Central Valley. So my guess is that if we go along for another 5 years, we're going to cut the swimming pools and David Kennedy's garden and various other things, and replace those lawns. But at some point, if we're in a drought that was unimaginable, it's a 1 in 500 year drought exacerbated by global warming. There's no question that we have the option of cutting the throat of agriculture and putting it back to the desert it once was in the Central Valley, and we probably can survive that drought. But that's from an objective point of view, that sounds very easy. From a political point of view, it's incredibly complex. And it's odd because they're not the most populous part of the state, but there's a real reluctance. Right now, agriculture only accounts for no more than 2% of our GDP. So it's not as if we took it out there, the state would go into a hole.
But Bruce, let me just remind us all of something to me is pretty obvious. Even those wasteful suburban lawn watering, car washing people eat food.
That's right.
So
Yep.
agriculture is not exactly.
Well, remember that many of the crops that they're growing are either specialty crops now that are soaking up more water, the trees, or they're cotton. Well, at least we've gotten rid of a lot of the cotton, but a lot of it is low-value crops, and there are other places in the world that you can import your food from. I don't really think we will starve. I mean, we've got the resources to import food. I think the honest answer is we don't really know why politically we're in the situation that we're in. A lot of people in the congressional delegation can't explain it, let alone political scientists. Why has it been so hard? Why is agriculture so powerful? Why are the first sacrifices made in the urban suburban areas? And again, it hasn't hurt us very much. Per capita water usage is down, and even though the population's grown, we're not actually using more water per capita. And there are more efficiencies that we can do. But if we're really in a serious, serious drought, I think it's a political problem, not a water problem.
And I think, this year you're seeing it on the ballot.
Yes.
The governor is not campaigning for himself. He hasn't cut a single ad for himself. He is now campaigning for Proposition 1, which it was a historic,
Tell everybody what Prop 1 is,
water
Carla,
bond,
Darrell.
and talk about that. I mean, to get the Republicans and Democrats together on this was a huge thing.
Water is a partisan issue, but as Bruce and David have said, it's also a regional issue. And getting water done in California seemed impossible. And yet again this year, the imperfect political system responded and came together, as Carla just said, in a not only bipartisan way, but in the Senate, a unanimous vote from the right to the left and everything in between to put a $7.5 billion water bond on the ballot. It's known as Proposition 1 on the ballot. And it will invest that level of resources in a variety of strategies to try to address the drought, although we don't have the power to make it rain. We do invest money in surface storage so that during the wet years you can store water, and thus during the dry years have water to rely on. We passed major groundwater legislation that said for the first time the groundwater in the aquifers needs to be accounted for as part of our water supply and can't be just used or wasted. We invest a lot in stormwater recapture and water recycling. We have 20% conservation in urban areas, voluntary for ag, as Bruce has said. And so the passage of that bond, and maybe more difficult than that, a political consensus about how to deal with the Delta, which is really the issue because northern or southern California, there's consensus that the Delta cannot be all things to all people. It can't be an estuary that is environmentally sound, and it can't continue to pump water in the same way it has pumped the water traditionally. And that we do need an alternative around the Delta. And God forbid, Northern California, and I'm a Northern California representative, I breathe those words, but we do need a project. And this question is the size, the scope, how much water is guaranteed for the Delta itself. And this is real political work that needs to be done over the next several years. Combined with a water bond, we are making progress.
Kate, I want to follow up I want to talk again about some of the challenges we're talking about, and we can cut to. I want to talk to you guys about education for a second, okay? So, because Darrell, we worked a lot.
I'm for it.
I know you are. I know. Despite your inferior college that you went to, but in any case. So that's right. Everybody got a photo of this. This is live, right? Okay. So you guys talked about education, and look, we worked a lot over the last few years on fundamental education stuff, but we still have one of the 10 in just pure test scores and other ways of measuring achievement here. We still have a long way to go in education. Number two, as you know, we got a half a loaf or a quarter of the loaf on the early childhood stuff this year, but we made progress, moved in the right direction. Next week, we're going to have the head of the most important union in the teachers union in the country here, Randy Weingarten, Linda Darling-Hammond, one of Stanford's greatest the country's greatest education professors, but who agrees with Randy a lot on this. how do you look at the state of California going forward for the next 5 years? Bruce, you as well, in terms of both the K through 12 education system and the college and the universities where there have been massive cuts at the state level, and say, we're going to invest in the future of education in this state?
Let me start, kids. I want to pick up on where Carla talked about Vergara. So I want to be a Democrat.
Do you guys know what Vergara is?
I want to be a Democrat that talks about Vergara first.
We got to tell them what Vergara is, though.
Yeah, Vergara is a lawsuit that has attracted not only state but national attention, which challenges a number of the rules impacting the hiring and firing of teachers and the length of time that teachers should have to serve before they get tenure. And I would say that reasonable people when it comes to the substance of this lawsuit can agree to disagree. It's arguable. You could say tenure should be 3 years instead of 2 years. That's a respectable argument. But I have a totally different opinion, which is I think that the people fighting about education reform in this state and in this country are missing the entire point. That Vergara case, as important as those issues are, in my view, it is a proxy fight for power. It's a proxy fight for power between the unions and those who believe the unions are the problem. And frankly, both sides are missing the point. Because if you believe that extending teacher tenure from 2 to 3 years is somehow going to make a dramatic difference in the performance of our kids, then you're talking about, in my view, a political agenda, not a substantive agenda.
Yeah.
And what really needs to happen here is a redefinition of education reform in a way that builds a bigger and broader agenda. Why is our education system so separate from our modern economy? Why is it that there is little or no relationship between not only high school education, but most college educations when it comes to a Bachelor of Arts and what qualifies people to do productive, middle to high wage work in our modern economy? Why aren't we having lawsuits about pedagogy and curriculum and about what we're teaching in 2014 instead of these narrow issues which really are important? I don't want to minimize them too much, but are a political fight that don't have as much relevance to real-world performance. To me, if we focused on early childhood education, universal preschool, and we got a commitment this year to preschool for all low-income 4-year-olds over the next 3 to 4 years. That was what we got. Good, not great. If we did that, and we brought career pathways to scale for high school students linked and articulated to community colleges, the CSU system, and yes, even the University of California, then we would be making real change that gave young people a pathway from education to their futures. And those aren't political issues. I've got to be like the guy tilting at the windmill to get the $500 million for the career pathways, and no political lift for it. I'm not, upset, but it's just, but it's really the truth. It's not the sexy education reform issue. The stuff that matters needs to become higher on the political pop charts. And let's redefine education reform and then go at it and fund it in a way that is systemic and that is more meaningful than the current debate today.
Remember this next week when we have Linda Darlingham and Randy Weingarten and Checker Finn here arguing over the Vergara case, which I guarantee you they're going to do. But I happen to agree 100% with what you just said. Bruce and Carla, and how do you guys see this?
Well, I think there's
this is such a big deal.
It is, and in this decision, the basis of the argument was, does the tenure system as it currently stands deny particularly inner city and poorer kids the right to a quality education that is protects teachers, it doesn't allow for layoffs. Obviously, the teachers union wants layoffs based on seniority. Is that the fairest way to do it to get the most quality education? But what people are also raising is how much the union spends in political campaigns. We're seeing millions of dollars in just one assembly race alone in the East Bay. So I think that's part of the equation as well. You're right. Are there ways to improve California education? Is that what we should look at, early childhood education? Yes, but it's also about the power of political money.
It's true.
And whether that's denying kids the best education.
You know, we've had this discussion for a couple decades, and I'm not sure. When I see the students that came through the University of California, I saw a lot of excellent students. So I think the real problem is that you have a greater degree of inequity than you had before, even despite the decisions, the Serrano decisions, and the attempt to sort of create a baseline. The reality is that in middle-class schools, you can supplement the budgets of those schools with foundations. And they can provide musical instruments, they can provide scientific training. And then you look at all the craziness around getting into college and all the special tutorial assistance you get, and the kids are taking these SAT exams 3 or 4 times, and they're paying thousands of dollars to get into it. I don't see that Serrano got us any closer to equity. I see no fault of the state, but just that in equilibrium, the people that have the resources are going to spend that money no matter what, and you can't prevent them from doing that. That's their right to do that. So the underlying inequality in the society, and some of it is along racial lines, is very hard to sort of counter through a state policy that says, okay, well, the funding should be as equal as possible, because Oakland's going to spend it on security, and upper class school is going to spend it on multivariate calculus.
Can I just say there's a shocking statistic out there that when I got into this early childhood education debate, I did not believe the first 5 times I heard it, and then it was verified. If you compare a low-income kid and a higher-income kid, at age 3, this child has heard 30 million fewer words than this child. 30 million! And you wonder why we have an achievement gap?
Well, we put ourselves in a real happy mood here.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question. It's related to education, but a little different vector than we've been talking about. That's Prop 13. I mean, there are those who would argue that the beginning of the end of the magnificent educational system that California had can be dated to the passage of Prop 13 to change the basis of school financing in ways that people here know more about than I do. But I'm reminded of a moment in the Arnold Schwarzenegger campaign when he appeared on the stage with Warren Buffett. And Warren Buffett said something to the effect that when Arnold is elected governor, the first thing he's going to do is take on Prop 13. And if I remember correctly, Schwarzenegger pushed him away from the microphone and said, Warren, if you mention that again, you're going to have to hit the deck and do 50 push-ups.
That's right.
Because it was, and as the cliche goes, the third rail of California politics.
And the illustration that, if I recall this correctly, Warren Buffett used is that he has a house where he grew up in
Laguna Beach.
Yeah.
No, well, that's his California
I believe
house.
his secretary paid has
Right,
more
about
higher
the
in
taxation.
taxes.
But his house in Laguna Beach, because of Prop 13, which locks in a very low rate of property tax accumulation, the value of the house, if he were to sell it, was, had gained in multiples from what he had paid. But the property taxes he paid on it were actually less than he paid on the house he owns in, where does he live, Nebraska?
Omaha.
So how could it be that the highly valuable piece of property owned in Laguna Beach, California, he paid less property tax on than the house he had in Omaha, Nebraska, which is the funding base for education in California? And to add one layer to this, to put this in the conversation, I've heard some rumblings about the prospect that Prop 13 might have some prospect for reform if it's just the commercial property tax exemptions.
Split roll.
So-called split roll.
Yeah, split roll.
That's right.
So I'm curious if we can talk a bit about that.
We've seen a bunch of polls on this, and people keep saying, look, as the population of California is aging, more and more younger people are coming up. They support a change in Prop 13, but the fact is, it's not there yet. It's pretty much split right now. And even Jerry Brown, who in the beginning, opposed Prop 13, and then came around when the people passed it, he has been reluctant to say, let's make a change in it. And you're absolutely right. Those raises in tuition that we've seen since when Jerry Brown went to the University of California, those all happened after Prop 13. But the political will isn't there right now.
Well, 2 things. A comment first about the initiative process and a little history here. The initiative process as it currently exists before yesterday when Governor Brown signed my bill, SB 1253, said once signatures are submitted, the initiative is a go, even though signatures have to be submitted some 9 or 10 months before the election. In 1978, there's a whole history here of the legislature failing to pass property tax reform itself. When Jarvis and Gans submitted those signatures in 1978, there was no turning back. Now under 1253 going forward, if something like that were to occur again, if a Jarvis or a Gans Jr. were to submit signatures in, say, February of an election year, the proponents would have all year with the legislature and the governor to try to craft a compromise and then remove the initiative from the ballot. So that's one, I think, good change. On the substance itself, I think residential property tax rates are a third rail, will be a third rail forever. And maybe they should be. I don't think we should necessarily be messing with the elderly's property tax rates. I think commercial is right, but harder than you think. It'll be a $200 million campaign if it ever qualifies. What is, again, under this notion of do what you can with the tools that you have and make progress, the most ripe area, in my view, is to lower the 2/3 threshold for special taxes at the local level, starting with education taxes, and then maybe transportation taxes. We have 55% for local school bonds, but not for school parcel taxes, which are operating money. I think that's right, because that would be consistent with Governor Brown's realignment philosophy, that you ought to empower those closest to the people to provide the service, and thus raise the money to provide the service at the same time. You may see that in the next few elections.
I mean, David, I know your opinions on initiatives, but Darrell, and just speaking to the Prop 13 thing, we looked, Carla, my brother and I, and we looked very seriously at taking on Prop 13. And because we did Prop 39 instead, we had to make a choice between doing the environmental initiative or doing, and I would argue, we believed that you could do the split roll, which is you take on the commercial rules, which are ridiculous. They make no sense from the standpoint of what's good for California. And but you're going to have $200 million spent against you. Right. The whole point is, and the thing I just want to say is, the change that this, I don't know the number, 1253 or whatever?
1253.
This is a very good thing, I think, and I'd be interested, David, since you've been, I know, in a very thoughtful way, a critic of the initiative process. This is a big change in the initiative process, that you can introduce something now, but then you can forge a compromise and not actually have to go to some of the extent that an initiative puts you in. And as someone who's worked on initiatives, put a couple on the ballot successfully, I think that's a much, much better solution than having to do an all or nothing.
We had a guy who was going to split up California into 6 states.
He was talking about that.
Collected 1.3 million signatures. So I think this is absolutely.
I was hoping I could run for governor of Millbrae.
By the way, Tim wanted to come tonight. He actually wanted to be part. Tim Draper wanted to be part of this discussion tonight, but he's too busy getting signatures for that ballot initiative.
Yeah, and he'll be back, I think.
So Darrell, just driving over here tonight, I heard on the radio that the governor signed today, I believe it was, a bill banning plastic bags.
Yes.
In the state.
First in the nation.
But in the same broadcast, virtually in the same breath, it was announced that a process has already begun to mount a referendum to repeal the law.
Yes.
So what will be the outcome?
Well, my 1253 would not solve that problem. The referendum still exists. It's the right of the people to contest a law passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. And maybe we need to look at the referendum process. I'm a believer in representative government. I mean, I think that the initiative and referendum ought to be a last resort and outlet. What too often happens, and I think what will happen in this case, it'll be, again, the special interests, large dollar donors that are going to try to make this plastic bag ban, which I voted for it, I think is a good thing, something other than it really is. And then the voters will have to make this decision when they've elected people like me to make these decisions. By the way, they can unelect us if they aren't happy with our decisions, and we have term limits in addition to that, and I'm gone. So, hooray! You can clap. That my bill dealt with the initiative process
Yeah.
and trying to create more functionality between these two power bases.
Yeah.
Representative government and the initiative industrial complex. And to try to say that at least at some point, before the final decision is made by the people, there ought to be more of an opportunity to come together and find a compromise. I think that's a healthy
But
thing.
what can we do about the money part of this whole equation? Because we talk about California being larger than life state, and this is where it gets absolutely crazy with these IEs that are out there. You know, one measure on the ballot alone, the medical malpractice issue, millions of dollars going into these, and we don't exactly know from where.
Well, you can't do anything about it because it's covered by the Supreme Court's decision.
Which
That's
we
right.
talked about this last
right.
week. This was a big discussion last week. It'll be a big discussion every week, which is the complete fiasco of a campaign finance system we have in the United States, where California is the poster child at a state level. But we talked about Citizens United and McCullough.
The decision with respect to initiatives predates any of those decisions. It's been the position of the court that you can only really restrict campaign spending or the right to contribute if it invokes some trade, quid pro quo corruption. And the initiative, you're not giving it to a candidate, so by definition, the court says it can't be, a form of corruption. You can't limit speech for the sake of equity or fairness or anything like that. So the problem is you really have to wait for the court's composition to change, and maybe someday in the future they would change it. But right now you can't. You have to take that as a constraint.
I consider myself a common cause Democrat. I have voted for every campaign finance reform that's ever come before me. And if I were still in the legislature, I would vote for no more. I think contribution limits, well intended as they are, it is pretending to do something that it does not do because of what Carla said. Because of the Citizens United, and it goes back to 1976 in Buckley v. Vallejo, the U.S. Supreme Court decision, you cannot restrict spending by any individual or any group. And so, yes, there may be contribution limits. People can only contribute to me $4,100. But guess what? If somebody wants to support me or oppose me, they can spend unlimited amounts without any accountability to me, or frankly to anybody else to say that I'm either the greatest guy in the world or the worst guy in the world. And so I'd rather have the money be given to the politicians with 24-hour reporting so that the public knows exactly who's getting the money, and then let them decide whether or not you're good or bad because you've taken X amount of money from an entity.
And it's true. And what does this mean for campaigns, for races in California? Who's going to be able to run in California? Right now, Jerry Brown, he's a freak show. I mean, he's a guy who's been here for 40 years and has $22 million and isn't going to spend a dime of it. And he'll be most likely reelected. But before that, the last time around, we had Meg Whitman, who spent $140 million of her own money. That's the kind of state we're in right now. Who's going to be able to run for office in California? Unless, we've got lots of folks in Silicon Valley that we, and people are already talking about the Sheryl Sandbergs and so forth, right? Maybe that's the future here because it is the nation's most populous state. And with 17 million voters, that's the only way you're going to be able to get a message.
Maybe that's the most compelling reason to make Silicon Valley its own state and let the super millionaires duke it out and the rest of them.
Getting more and more depressing, at least.
No, come on, it's not so bad.
We started off thinking that there was
so bad.
the Golden State was on a comeback.
Yeah,
It is in a
It is on a
comeback.
comeback. All right. Well, we've really kind of drilled down on some particular issues: plastic bags, commercial tax roll, property tax roll. Let's open the scope a bit here. There have been a lot of questions from the students that connect to issues of climate change and the water crisis in California. And among the questions involves looking at what a bellwether state like California can do, but other states as well, to deal with, as Bruce described it earlier, stuff that happens to us that isn't the product of any choice that we make. if climate change is a reality, and there's every reason to believe that it is, and that it's only going in the wrong direction, what kinds of efforts can and should California make as a bellwether state, not merely for its own citizens and to deal with the crisis that besets us here as citizens of the state, but that have implications and ramifications globally, of course, nationally too. What is it that California should be doing to set the standard to deal with the effects of climate change?
Well, we've done it already with AB 32, in my humble opinion.
And what is AB 32?
AB 32 is the cap and trade that was put in place during the Schwarzenegger year and then reaffirmed in an initiative vote. And to be honest, this is the downside of the initiative process is that we get some stuff that makes us shake our heads. The upside is that occasionally the initiative process, and at least either directly through the passage or the pressure it puts on the legislature, creates innovation. And I think California has had a role because of its willingness to try everything. As an innovator in climate, if you think of auto emissions, we basically, because we got a waiver from the EPA, we're able to prove that the auto companies could indeed manufacture cars that were not polluting, and at the same time could find a market for those cars. So there is a history of California showing people that something is doable, and I think that's what we're trying to do in climate change, and I'm really proud of the legislature and proud of the people that they're sticking with the drill, even though there are lots of reasons to say, well, China's not doing enough, India's not doing enough, Pennsylvania's not doing enough, Wyoming's not doing enough, so therefore let's fold our cards and quit. I think that's short-sighted. I think there is a demonstration effect, and I think if we can make the kinds of changes, not just AB 32 cap and trade, but also energy efficiencies. I know I just came back from Wyoming. They're dying to sell us their wind. They have a lot of wind, and they want to put transmission lines, and they've actually got it all the way to Las Vegas, and it might make it all the way here. We could reach out to them. They don't belong to any regional arrangement right now, and we asked them, would you join an arrangement with California? They said, well, nobody would want us. We're the coal state. But maybe that's actually taking a leadership in creating a regional market and including a coal state like that, but in order to get their wind. Maybe that's the kind of thing that we do. So, I actually think that's an area where I feel proud about being in California, and I do think there have been important changes.
I also wonder, we've seen Jerry Brown really take a leadership role in this. He's talked about this issue as the #1 issue facing California. Yeah. He just came back from the United Nations. He addressed them on that. You have to kind of wonder, are we going to start looking at other sources, maybe nuclear? Where is California going to go? And California has led the way. And we talk about wind, solar being expanded in California. So Jerry Brown has been out there on this one, and the legislature has been out there on this one.
And we're going to have a great class. And we're going to have a great class on the 21st with Steve Chu and Tom somebody or other. Yeah. And
what's his name?
I don't remember. But about this, because this is the state that is going to have. This is the state that is going to look at it's way beyond just climate change. It's the energy issues that are really going to come up.
I want to put forward a challenge, though, because I'm very proud of the work the state has done on climate change. We lead the nation and the world, and yet I worry about it because I know this year there was a strong effort to convince the legislature to not impose a cap and trade on the fuel economy. And the argument was it's going to raise fuel prices. Well, it may not. Fuel prices sort of go up and down independent of that. But there was a real strong effort to say this climate change thing has gone too far. We ought not to include fuels under cap and trade. And so what it says to me is that we need to continue to try to build broader coalitions around climate change. Why is it important that we use cap and trade dollars as we committed to do this year as a permanent source for public transit? because public transit is not just about climate change, it's primarily about climate change, but it's also about transportation accessibility for working people and low-income people. And it's also a great driver of high-wage jobs, infrastructure investment. So I think we need to always think about the climate change battle, not only in California, but throughout the country, and expand it to really make an economy, our economy, its focus as well, and to focus on the inequities, the fact that we do have a state and largely a country where you have a lot of haves and a lot of have-nots.
And I think that goes to another issue in the governor's race, the high-speed rail, that Governor Brown is so supportive of. Is the public with him on this one? You know, his argument is, as you said, look, we've got to have these huge infrastructure issues for the future to plant, to
Right.
do exactly what you said, to protect the environment, to begin working millions of people into public transportation. But the fact is, as you know, this project is hugely controversial. It's become sort of a central issue in the governor's race. As Neel Kashkari, the Republican, has called it the crazy train. And it's hard to tell where the public is at on it as you keep adding on the price and watching issues like the Bay Bridge and how many problems that have been with that.
Yes.
You know,
I think the public is skeptical, but it's one of those things where they give him the benefit of the doubt, and he believes, and I believe, that 30 years from now, the next generation will look back and say, thank you for taking the heat and doing that.
David, do you want to do a last question? We're going to sort of summarize everything. I was going to, the one I want to ask, and then is how did Jerry Brown morph from Governor Moonbeam to where he is now? It's quite remarkable. No, it's quite remarkable.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
And then to David. I mean, how did you guys have all watched him do this? How did Jerry Brown go from the first Jerry Brown to the second Jerry Brown?
I mean, this is a guy, nowhere else in America do you see a political story like this. You know, a governor who is in the same speech quoting, you know, Plato's Republic and the little engine that could. You know, he is a guy who has done just about everything in public service, from, you know, Los Angeles Community College Board, Secretary of State to Mayor of Oakland, something that just, I think, changed his outlook and gave him the nitty-gritty. He has more kind of experience. And he knows the state, I think, more granularly than many politicians do. I've traveled with him, and you can go to any little community, and he's been there with his dad, who was the governor, or he had family members there, or he's campaigned there. It's such an unusual situation to have someone with this kind of longevity in politics. It's so fascinating to watch the character of Jerry Brown. And you know, I think we're going to be watching him for another term.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. He definitely learned a lot, both in his first term and also going down and becoming Oakland mayor. I think he learned a lot as an Oakland mayor, including where the money was hidden for redevelopment funds, so he could steal it.
Absolutely.
So, but anyway, you know,
That's true.
that was a useful trick. It was a good idea, I guess. But I also think that the times caught up to Jerry Brown in two senses. Jerry Brown was not a relationship governor when there's first round. He didn't really talk to the legislature very well, and they didn't like him for that. But it turned out that when the term limits are, relationships don't matter as much. So he's actually a good governor for the term limits era. And then more importantly, I think the world has caught up to him on some of his ideas about the environment. He was very early into the environment and wind farms and things like that, and that contributed in the rest of America to the perception that he was, you know, out to lunch. But in reality, you know, those attitudes have changed quite a bit. So I think part of it is that the future caught up to Jerry Brown, and what was Moonbeam then is, you know, more routine at this point.
And don't forget Ann Gus Brown either. She's had a major impact on him for obvious reasons. They're married, and she is every bit the partner with him. And I just want to agree with Carla that in my time in politics, I have never met someone with as finely tuned a skill in terms of understanding public opinion and understanding the voting public as Jerry Brown. Nobody. And so he knows, again, it can be frustrating at times, and that's what, we argue, and he's not always right either, but he knows better than anybody how far to push on a given issue at a particular time. Been very effective.
We're just about out of time. Do you want to add something? Or?
Well, I just had one quick thought about the energy issue in particular, and energy/environment. For all that California has done and promises to do, it can't do it alone. And not least of all because California is one of a dozen plus states that participate in the Western electricity grid. That's a very badly managed entity, as I understand it. And we're actually, the Bill Lane Center for the American West and the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research are sponsoring a conference next month, November 18th, actually. And one of the things we're going to be looking at on that day is what are the regional implications of AB 32? We've got X number of years of history with it now. Has it in fact induced other kinds of behaviors in our neighboring states or not? I think the jury's still out. We really don't know.
Yeah.
All right, well, we have that to look forward to. We'll advertise that more broadly as well. Thank you for joining us the second evening, and we'll meet you again next week. Please join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.